The massive alien ship called Harmony shook violently as it pushed through Earth's crazy weather. Lightning bolts the size of skyscrapers crackled around its hull while chunks of burning rock from distant volcanoes bounced off its shields. Commander Veltar gripped his chair tighter, his blue skin turning pale as he watched the readings on his screen. This planet was trying to kill everything on it, including his ship. Veltar had been exploring new worlds for over 30 years, but he had never seen anything like this. His species, the Altarians, came from a peaceful world with gentle rains and soft breezes. Most planets in the galaxy were similar, calm, predictable, safe. But Earth was different. Earth was angry. His science officer, a nervous creature with 4 eyes, kept shaking his head at the data streams flowing across his monitors. The numbers made no sense. This world should be dead. The ground moved constantly from earthquakes. That would level entire cities on civilized planets. Storms with winds strong enough to toss spaceships around like toys happened every few months. The oceans were full of creatures with teeth longer than a grown alien's arm. Even the tiny invisible bugs in the water could kill most galactic species in hours. But somehow, impossibly, billions of creatures lived here. Not just survived, they were thriving. The aliens could see massive cities built right on top of earthquake zones. Farms stretched across areas that got hit by devastating storms every year. Ports and harbors sat next to oceans filled with monsters that could swallow their ship whole. When they finally landed in a field outside a small human town, Veltar expected to meet some kind of warrior species, maybe creatures with thick armor plating and natural weapons. Instead, a regular-looking man in dirty work clothes walked over to greet them. He had dirt under his fingernails and smiled like meeting aliens was the most normal thing in the world. The human introduced himself as Jake Morrison, a corn farmer. When dark clouds started gathering overhead and the wind picked up, Jake casually mentioned they should probably head inside because tornado season was starting. Veltar had no idea what a tornado was, but the way Jake said it made his stomach twist with worry. Inside Jake's simple wooden house, Veltar watched in complete terror as Jake's 8-year-old daughter Lisa played with the family pets. One was a massive dog with powerful jaws that could easily crush an Altarian skull. Another was some kind of scaled creature that Jake called a bearded dragon, though it looked nothing like the galaxy's legendary dragons. Lisa hugged these deadly beasts like they were stuffed toys while a storm outside shook the entire house. Jake served them something called coffee, while explaining how their area got hit by tornadoes about twice a year. He talked about it the way most species discussed mildly annoying weather like light rain. Meanwhile, Veltar could see through the window as the storm outside picked up entire trees and threw them around like toothpicks. The most shocking part was how normal it all seemed to the humans. Jake's wife Beth came home from her job at the local hospital, where she apparently dealt with people injured by wild animals and natural disasters every single day. Their teenage son Danny complained about having to help repair the barn again after the last earthquake damaged it. They treated living on this nightmare planet like it was perfectly ordinary. Over the following days, Veltar met dozens of humans from the nearby town. They were teachers, mechanics, store owners, and construction workers. None of them had special armor or weapons. They looked soft and vulnerable compared to most galactic species. Yet they had built a thriving civilization on a world that should have wiped them out millions of years ago. When Veltar returned to the Galactic Council chambers on the capital world, he struggled to explain what he had seen. The other council members listened to his report with growing disbelief. These humans had somehow adapted to the most hostile environment anyone had ever discovered. But they seemed primitive compared to advanced galactic technology. The council decided humans were just an oddly lucky species that had managed to survive through sheer chance. They offered Earth basic membership with severe restrictions. No access to advanced weapons, no voting rights in galactic decisions, and definitely no involvement in military affairs. After all, What could these simple farmers and small folks possibly contribute to sophisticated galactic civilization? It was a decision the galaxy would soon regret. The nightmare began on a quiet Tuesday morning when long-range scanners detected something impossible moving through the outer edges of the galaxy. At first, the readings looked like a glitch in the system. Then, the reports started flooding in. From border colonies, entire worlds going silent in a matter of hours. The enemy called themselves the Void Swarm, and they moved through space like a disease made of metal and hate. Their ships didn't look like anything the galaxy had ever seen before. Instead of sleek hulls and elegant designs, they were twisted masses of sharp angles and exposed machinery that seemed to rebuild themselves as they moved. They consumed everything: planets, moons, space stations, even asteroids, turning all matter into more of themselves. Admiral Corton stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Crystal Dawn, watching his tactical display with growing horror. The Centaurian fleet was supposed to be unstoppable. Their ships were marvels of engineering, with shields that could deflect small suns and weapons that could crack moons in half. But every time they engaged the swarm, something went wrong. The first battle had gone exactly as planned. Corton's dreadnoughts formed perfect battle lines and unleashed devastating volleys of plasma fire. The swarm ships took heavy damage and retreated. Victory seemed certain. But when they met the enemy again 3 days later, the same weapons barely scratched their hulls. Somehow, the swarm had adapted their defenses to counter every attack. It got worse with each engagement. The swarm learned from every mistake, every weakness, every successful tactic the galactic forces used against them. They studied their enemies like scientists examining bugs under a microscope, then evolved countermeasures faster than anyone thought possible. Energy weapons. The swarm developed reflective armor, kinetic rounds. They grew reactive plating that absorbed the impact. Nuclear missiles. The swarm ships started eating the radiation and using it to power their own systems. In the Grand War Council chambers on the capital world, panic filled the air like smoke. Generals from a dozen different species argued over battle plans, while holographic displays showed the swarm's steady advance through civilized space. Every strategy they tried failed within days. Every technological advantage they possessed became useless as the enemy adapted. Major Tom Bradley sat quietly in the back corner, representing Earth's tiny contribution to the galactic defense effort. At 52 years old, he looked older than his years, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes from decades of military service. The other officers barely acknowledged his presence. After all, Earth had been given the lowest possible security clearance and was only allowed to send one observer to the meetings. Tom listened to the alien generals debate their next move with growing frustration. They talked about the war like it was a complex equation they just needed to solve correctly. They analyzed enemy movements with mathematical precision and planned their responses, like chess masters thinking 20 moves ahead. Everything had to be perfect, calculated, and elegant. The problem was that the Void Swarm didn't play by those rules. They were chaos given form, destruction that learned and adapted faster than any civilization could respond, while the galactic forces spent weeks planning the perfect counterattack. The swarm consumed 3 more star systems. Finally, Tom couldn't stay quiet anymore. During a heated argument between 2 crystal-skinned generals about optimal fleet formations, he stood up and cleared his throat. The room gradually fell silent as dozens of alien eyes turned toward the lone human. "You're fighting them like a chess match?" Tom said, his voice steady and calm despite the tension in the room. "Back home, we learned long ago, sometimes you have to flip the board." General Kavara of the Crystal Empire turned toward Tom with obvious irritation. Her crystalline features reflected the light from the holographic displays as she spoke with barely contained disdain. "Your primitive warfare has no place in sophisticated combat, human. We will solve this with superior technology and tactics. But Tom had seen this kind of enemy before, back on Earth. Not exactly the same, of course, but close enough. Adaptive opponents who learned from every encounter and used that knowledge against you. The solution wasn't more advanced technology or better strategies. Sometimes the only way to win was to do something so unexpected, so completely insane, that the enemy couldn't adapt fast enough to stop you. 3 more core worlds fell that week, their populations consumed and converted into raw materials for the growing swarm. The galaxy's greatest military minds watched helplessly as their perfect strategies crumbled against an enemy that refused to follow the established rules of warfare. In his small quarters aboard the command station, Tom stared out at the stars and thought about home, about the countless wars humanity had fought against overwhelming odds, about all the times they had won not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they were willing to do what nobody else would even consider. The galaxy was about to learn what desperation looked like. The emergency broadcast from Alteria Prime crackled through space with desperation that made even hardened military officers feel sick to their stomachs. The planet's entire defense fleet was gone. Billions of civilians huddled in underground shelters as the void swarm tore apart everything above ground, turning their beautiful crystal cities into raw materials for more death machines. Every major military force in the galaxy received a distress call. The Centaurian fleet was too busy defending their own territory. The Crystal Empire claimed they couldn't spare any ships. The Ethereal Collective offered thoughts and prayers, but no actual help. One by one, the great powers of the galaxy found excuses to look the other way while an entire civilization died. But on Earth, things were different. Admiral Rachel Davis sat in her small office at Terra Command, listening to the desperate pleas from Alteria Prime for the 15th time. At 46, she was younger than most fleet commanders, with short brown hair and calloused hands that showed she had worked her way up from the engine rooms. Around her, the walls were covered with photos of friends who had died in various Earth conflicts over the years. Rachel knew the smart play was to stay out of it. Earth's entire fleet consisted of 40 ships that weren't even proper warships. They were converted mining vessels, cargo haulers, and exploration craft that had been hastily fitted with weapons and shields. Going up against the void swarm with that kind of force was basically suicide. But Rachel also knew something the alien commanders didn't understand. Sometimes the right thing to do and the smart thing to do were completely different. And humans had never been particularly good at choosing the smart option when people were dying. Within 6 hours, every available human ship was loaded with volunteers and racing toward Alteria Prime. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Captain Mike Johnson had spent most of his career hauling ice from asteroid mines. Lieutenant Amy Wilson was an engineer who had learned to fight during the Mars Colony uprising. Sergeant Bob Chen was a mechanic who could fix anything with duct tape and determination. What they lacked in training and equipment, they made up for with something the galaxy had forgotten existed: the willingness to die for complete strangers, simply because it was the right thing to do. When the human fleet arrived at Alteria Prime, they found a nightmare scene. Swarm ships the size of city blocks were systematically dismantling the planet's surface, while smaller vessels hunted down fleeing civilian transports. The humans were outnumbered 50 to 1, and their improvised weapons were laughably primitive compared to the enemy's adaptive technology. Any sane military force would have retreated immediately. Instead, Captain Mike Johnson pointed his converted cargo hauler straight at the largest swarm dreadnought and pushed his engines to maximum power. The alien survivors hiding in bunkers deep underground watched their sensors in disbelief as the human ship accelerated directly toward certain death. Mike's voice came over the radio.com, and steady as he gave his final orders to his crew. "Get to the escape pods. Make sure you tell folks back home we gave them hell." The explosion when Mike's ship hit the swarm dreadnought lit up half the system. The massive enemy vessel, which had seemed indestructible just moments before, broke apart as its power core went critical. Mike and 12 of his crew members died instantly, but their sacrifice created a gap in the swarm formation that other human ships immediately exploited. Lieutenant Amy Wilson led the charge into that gap, commanding 3 converted mining ships, loaded with improvised explosives and desperate volunteers. While the swarm was still reacting to Mike's kamikaze attack, Amy's ships latched onto smaller enemy vessels like ticks on a dog. Her engineering teams cut through swarm holes with industrial lasers and planted homemade bombs throughout their command centers. The aliens watching from their shelters couldn't understand what they were seeing. "They're insane," whispered Talani, a survivor who had worked as a cultural observer before the war. "How can they throw their lives away so easily for people they've never even met?" But the humans weren't throwing their lives away. They were spending them like currency to buy time and hope for others. Each death created opportunities for their comrades to strike harder. Each sacrifice inspired the survivors to fight with even more determination. Amy Wilson died when her ship's reactor overloaded inside a swarm cruiser, but her sacrifice gutted the enemy vessel's navigation systems. Sergeant Bob Chen went down fighting hand-to-hand with swarm drones in the corridors of an enemy command ship, but not before he disabled their communication arrays with a wrench and some creative engineering. The pattern repeated itself across the battlefield. Humans died by the dozens, but each death weakened the swarm in ways their adaptive systems couldn't immediately counter. The enemy had learned to defend against advanced energy weapons and sophisticated tactics, but they had no protocols for dealing with opponents who were willing to ram ships into their hulls or fight with improvised weapons in zero gravity. For the first time since the war began, swarm ships started pulling back from a battle. Their adaptive systems were designed to learn from repeated engagements, but the humans kept doing things that made no tactical sense. How do you adapt to an enemy that treats suicide attacks as routine tactics? The surviving human ships pressed their advantage, hunting down retreating swarm vessels with the fury of people who had just watched their friends die. They fought with a savage desperation that the civilized galaxy had forgotten how to access, turning their grief into a weapon more powerful than any technology. By the time the battle ended, 37 of the 40 human ships were destroyed or crippled, but Alteria Prime was still free, and its people were alive to see another sunrise. News of the impossible victory spread through the galaxy like wildfire, carrying with it a message that would change everything. The Void Swarm could be beaten. The news from Alteria Prime hit the galaxy like a shockwave that nobody saw coming. For months, every battle report had been the same depressing story. Another world consumed, another fleet destroyed, another species driven to the edge of extinction. The Void Swarm seemed unstoppable, adapting to every weapon and tactic the civilized galaxy could throw at them. Then suddenly, impossibly, a ragtag collection of human cargo ships had done what the galaxy's greatest military minds couldn't accomplish. They had made the swarm retreat, not through superior technology or brilliant strategy, but through sheer stubborn refusal to give up even when facing certain death. Within hours of the victory, Colonel Frank Roberts found his quiet life turned completely upside down. At 58, Frank had been looking forward to retirement on a small farm back on Earth. Instead, he was suddenly the most requested military advisor in galactic history. His communication system buzzed constantly, with calls from alien commanders who desperately wanted to understand how humans had achieved the impossible. The first meeting took place on Centauri Station, a massive space facility that served as the galaxy's primary military headquarters. Frank walked into a conference room filled with the most advanced species in known space, feeling slightly ridiculous in his simple Earth military uniform, surrounded by beings who looked like living crystals, energy patterns, and creatures that seemed to be made of liquid metal. Commander Yildiz of the Ethereal Fleet was the first to speak. Her species existed as pure energy most of the time, only taking physical form when necessary. She flickered between states as she talked, which Frank found distracting, but tried not to mention. Colonel Roberts, our analysts have studied the battle recordings from Alteria Prime dozens of times. Your tactics make no logical sense. You deliberately sent ships to their destruction. Frank nodded, settling into his chair with the kind of calm that came from decades of explaining difficult concepts to nervous recruits. That's right. Captain Johnson's ramming attack opened up the enemy formation. Lieutenant Wilson's boarding parties disabled their command ships. Sergeant Chen's hand-to-hand fighting disrupted their coordination systems. But they died, interrupted General Kethmer of the Crystal Empire, his diamond-like features reflecting the room's lights. Valuable ships, trained personnel, irreplaceable resources, all thrown away from marginal tactical advantages. Not thrown away, Frank said quietly, invested. Each of those deaths accomplished something specific. Johnson's sacrifice created the opening we needed. Wilson's boarding parties gave us intelligence about swarm internal systems. Chun's close combat showed us that their drones have weaknesses in hand-to-hand situations. The alien officers exchanged glances that Frank was learning to recognize. It was the look civilized species got when humans suggested something that went against thousands of years of military doctrine. In galactic warfare, you protected your assets. You minimized casualties. You never deliberately sacrificed valuable resources unless absolutely necessary. Commander Yildiz shifted back to her energy form, which Frank had learned meant she was agitated. You want us to deliberately sacrifice our ships? Our people? This goes against everything we believe about the value of life. Frank leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes one death saves 1,000. Your people need to learn that survival isn't about avoiding all risk. It's about taking the right risks at the right time. The room fell silent as the alien commanders processed this concept. For species that had evolved on gentle worlds with predictable environments, the idea of calculated sacrifice was almost incomprehensible. They had built their civilizations on the principle of preservation, protecting what you had rather than risking it for potential gains. But Frank could see understanding slowly dawning in their eyes. The Void Swarm was an enemy unlike anything they had ever faced before. Traditional tactics weren't working. Maybe it was time to try something that seemed insane by civilized standards. Over the following weeks, Frank found himself traveling from world to world, teaching alien officers concepts that human children learned from playground games: how to take acceptable losses, when to retreat, and when to press an attack, even when the odds were against you. Most importantly, how to think like someone who had grown up on a world that was constantly trying to kill you. The results were remarkable and terrifying to watch. The Crystal Empire's rigid battle formations became fluid and unpredictable. Their commanders started making split-second decisions instead of waiting for perfect information. When a swarm adaptive shield began deflecting their energy weapons, crystal ships would immediately switch to ramming attacks that their enemies hadn't prepared for. The ethereal fleet discovered something they had never experienced before: the rush of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Their energy beings began taking physical form during battles, making themselves vulnerable, but gaining the ability to perform boarding actions against swarm vessels. They learned to value quick thinking over perfect planning, spontaneous heroism over calculated safety. Most surprisingly, species that had spent centuries refusing to cooperate began working together like they had been allies forever. Human tactical advisors helped coordinate joint operations between forces that had never trusted each other before. The rigid hierarchy of galactic civilization gave way to something more flexible and effective. Reports started coming in from battlefields across the galaxy. A combined crystal ethereal fleet had successfully defended the vegan system, using human-style sacrifice tactics. Altarian survivors, inspired by their human rescuers, had volunteered for suicide missions against swarm logistics ships. Even the cautious Centaurian Republic was experimenting with acceptable risk strategies. For the first time since the war began, the daily casualty reports showed something other than total disaster. Systems that had been written off as lost were being retaken. Swarm advances were being stopped and reversed. The tide of metal and death that had seemed unstoppable was finally being pushed back. The galaxy's news feeds buzzed with stories of unlikely heroism. Species that had been considered cowardly were performing acts of desperate courage. Military units that had never worked together were coordinating like they had trained for years. And at the center of it all were the humans, the species from the Deathworld, who had taught everyone else how to fight like their lives depended on it, because sometimes they really did. The war was finally over, but the galaxy would never be the same again. 3 years had passed since the last Void Swarm ship was destroyed in the Outer Rim territories. Yet the scars of that terrible conflict remained visible everywhere you looked. Entire star systems had been consumed and rebuilt. Billions of lives had been lost. And in the center of it all, humanity had somehow managed to teach an entire galaxy how to fight for something bigger than themselves. The Memorial Wall on New Geneva had become the most visited site in known space. It stretched across the surface of the small moon for nearly 8 miles, a massive structure built from stone quarried from every world that had participated in the war. Each name carved into its surface represented someone who had died fighting the swarm, but the human names seemed to glow with special significance. Admiral Susan Carter walked slowly along the wall during the dedication ceremony, her dress uniform crisp despite the gentle breeze that swept across the memorial grounds. At 61, she was one of the oldest surviving human officers from the war. Gray streaks ran through her dark hair, and her face carried the kind of lines that came from making impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure. She had been there when Captain Mike Johnson rammed his ship into the first swarm dreadnought. She had watched Lieutenant Amy Wilson lead her final boarding action. She had held Sergeant Bob Chin's hand as he died in a field hospital after his last desperate fight. Around her, delegates from over 1,000 different species stood in respectful silence. The ceremony was being broadcast live across every inhabited world in the galaxy, watched by trillions of beings who wanted to pay their respects to those who had saved them all. Crystal beings that normally glowed with inner light had dimmed themselves to match the somber mood. Energy creatures that rarely took physical form had materialized just to be present for this moment. Elder Marnthe of the Galactic Council stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. Her species, the Valdari, were ancient beyond measure. They had been exploring space when most other civilizations were still learning to make fire. Her voice carried the weight of centuries as she spoke about the lessons the galaxy had learned. They came from a world that tried to kill them every day, she said, her words echoing across the memorial grounds through translation devices that converted her meaning into thousands of different languages. Every sunrise brought new dangers. Every season tested their will to survive. And from that harsh crucible, they learned something the rest of us had forgotten, that strength isn't about avoiding death. It's about choosing what's worth dying for. The crowd remained silent as her words sank in. For most species in the galaxy, death was something to be avoided at all costs. Their civilizations had been built around the principle of preservation. Protecting what you had, minimizing risk, ensuring that every individual life was treasured and preserved. But humans had shown them that sometimes, the only way to protect what you love is to risk losing everything. The changes had already begun spreading throughout galactic civilization. The old Terran calendar, which had once been dismissed as primitive and irrelevant, was now used to mark time on worlds thousands of light years from Earth. Human philosophies about sacrifice, courage, and moral responsibility were being taught in schools across hundreds of different species. Children who had never seen Earth were learning about the Deathworld species that had saved them all. On Centauri Prime, young crystal beings played games that mimicked the desperate boarding actions humans had pioneered during the war. Ethereal children practiced taking physical form so they could better understand the concept of mortality that had driven human heroism. Even the cautious Faldari had begun teaching their youth about acceptable risks and calculated sacrifice. The memorial ceremony continued for hours as representatives from each world read the names of their fallen heroes. But everyone knew that the human names carried special weight. Jake Morrison, the simple farmer who had first welcomed aliens to Earth, had died defending a refugee convoy during the final battles. Mike Johnson's ramming attack had become the standard tactic taught in military academies across the galaxy. Amy Wilson's boarding techniques were now part of basic training for every Space Force. But the real monuments to human sacrifice weren't made of stone and metal. Throughout the vast emptiness between stars, monitoring stations kept eternal watch for any sign that the Void Swarm might return. These facilities were named after fallen heroes: the Jake Morrison Deep Space Observatory, the Mike Johnson Early Warning Array, the Amy Wilson Research Station. Each one was staffed by volunteers from dozens of different species, all united by the human-taught principle that some duties were worth any sacrifice. The galaxy's children grew up learning stories about the species from the Deathworld who had faced annihilation with steady hands and brave hearts. They learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing what needed to be done despite being terrified. They learned that sometimes one person's sacrifice could save millions of lives. Most importantly, they learned that when darkness comes calling, someone has to be willing to answer. As the ceremony ended and the delegates began to disperse, Admiral Susan Carter remained by the memorial wall. She placed her hand on Mike Johnson's name, carved deep into stone, from his home state of Montana. Around her, the stars shone down on a galaxy that had been forever changed by a species that refused to give up. Even when giving up would have been easier. The cosmos would remember their sacrifice forever, not because humans were the strongest or smartest species in the galaxy, but because when everything seemed hopeless, they were the ones who stepped forward and said, "Not today." They had taught an entire galaxy that sometimes the greatest civilizations are forged in the hardest places, and that true strength comes not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head-on with your friends by your side. The war was over, but humanity's greatest victory was just beginning. They had given the galaxy something it had never possessed before: the knowledge that no darkness is so complete that it cannot be driven back by those brave enough to light a candle and hold it high.